All right, thank you for having me here. So I'll talk today about digital audio, and by digital audio, I really mean when you listen to audio, whether it's the AM, FM, digital streams or music services or podcasts, so it's not DAB, just to make sure we're clear on the usage of terms, because I know it changes from country to country. So just a quick note on Triton, and then I'll dive into the numbers. So we've been in business for more than 10 years. We have two product names that you may have heard of. A2X, which is the programmatic marketplace for programmatic audio, and Webcast Metrics, which is our measurement service. So I'll be using Webcast Metrics data to provide some insights here. We operate in 45 countries. I'm from Montreal, but I'm based in London. So we work with three types of clients. We have AM, FM stations, we have podcast producers, and we have music services as clients. So just a quick note on Webcast Metrics to understand how we get the data. So Webcast Metrics is a census-based audience measurement. So it's not measuring campaigns, it's measuring audience. And it's census-based, meaning that we measure all sessions, whether you're listening to the player controlled by the publisher, or if you're listening through another endpoint like a Sonos system, smart speakers, or iTunes with amps in cars on a mobile phone. Wherever you are, we'll be able to catch the sessions, because we could either install an application on the app owned by the publishers like Spotify, Pandora, and others, or use the logs coming from the streaming servers. And both methodology are accredited by the Media Rating Council in the US, the MRC. And we have some rules also to remove the invalid sessions. So all the sessions coming from the publishers' offices will be removed. If the session is less than a minute, we'll remove it. And then the MRC is publishing a list of fraudulent IP address frequently, so we need to discard all of those as well. We publish rankers, so we have a global ranker, we have a US ranker, and we have a Latin American ranker. We're actually, we will be releasing an APAC ranker as well as an EMEA ranker before the end of the year to be able to show a bit the scale in these two parts of the world. And then we may refine by more precise regions and countries at some point. So to just give an idea, so all of these rankers are on Triton website. It's publicly available. So to just have a glimpse of the three rankers, the 6 positions there. We do not measure at this stage all publishers out there, but for those measured, you would see here how they perform in each of the markets. So in the US, for instance, the music services are listed because this is what the US market wants. They want to have a mix of all type of digital audio. In Latin America, they're excluded because this is how the market wants, and globally it depends of the publishers. At the moment, Pandora and Spotify are not listed. We may actually create a music service ranker, a global music service ranker at some point. What's interesting with digital audio is when you use the currency measurement in each country, you always look into the local publishers for sure, but once you start looking at those global rankers or national rankers, you realize, regional rankers, sorry, you realize that there's actually a fair amount of listenership coming from out-of-market publishers, which will bring a lot of audience, which is quite interesting for advertisers because like for instance, here in Australia, Prisa Radio, which is a Spanish broadcasters that own a lot of stations in Latin America, has a fair market share in Australia. So if any agencies are trying to target expat from speaking Spanish, then you know that you could actually hit them on the streams you're listening from Prisa Radio. And we have the same from Talpa Radio, which is a Dutch publishers, or Carnival, which is a Turkish publisher. So there's a lot of ways that you could use online audio differently than simply thinking about the known AM, FM stations that you have in the market. So I forgot to talk about the different terminology. So average active session is a session of at least a minute, and it's concurrent sessions. So when you look here, let's say on a global ranker, iHeartRadio, that means there's 361,000 concurrent listeners during 6 a.m. and 8 p.m. On weekdays. It's the same concept as average quarter hours, but in digital terms. So it gives an idea of the reach and then the frequency of the listening. And 0.51 means 30 minutes because the MRC wants it in fraction of an hour. So that's why 51 is not 51 minutes, but actually like 30 minutes. That's just the MRC terminology. So if you look at the growth in the US, you see that as we speak, every day of the week, there's over 5 million concurrent listeners listening to online audio in the US. In the US, the Webcast metrics is the currency for online audio. So basically, we measure everyone. So this is really the total scale of the US market at the moment. I will be using some published and many unpublished data set from the Infinite Dial Edison Research because we sponsored them in the US and we're one of the sponsors in Australia. So you see that in the US, the market penetration of monthly listening is much higher. That could be explained in Australia that the DAB that does not exist in the US because HD radio is not working well in the US. That could explain maybe the gap, or maybe it started more recently because you see here that there's a big difference between the two. But you'll see later on that the growth is almost the same on other topics. So just to give some broad idea of for the comparison, in terms of internet access, we see it's almost the same between the US and Australia in terms of where people have access to the internet. Maybe schools and college here in Australia don't have Wi-Fi across the board. In the US, it's quite common. Daily time spent, so the radio is actually more listened in Australia than in the US. And TV is a bit less listened, so that's interesting. It means that radio, at least based on the Edison research panel, seems that radio has a stronger footprint in Australia. So when you look at the trends, you see that listening to online audio is a bit smaller in Australia than the US, but almost the same. Listening to any type of sources of radio is higher. And then when you look into who's connecting a mobile phone in their cars, you see that only 15% of the Australian drivers are doing that, and 40% of the US drivers are connecting their smartphones on the car to listen to online audio. Again, maybe because cars here have the DAB radio receiver and people prefer using digital broadcast than over IP broadcast, but that's where I see a difference at the moment. So the install mobile application. So for some reason, during the panel from Edison, SoundCloud, even though we know there's listenership in Australia, has not been shown in the amongst the application installs on the panel surveyed by Edison. Then when you look at the different comparison, you see that Panora is really strong in the US, and here they even shut down their operation. So next year, I suppose that light blue bar will have disappeared. I don't know if Spotify or SoundCloud will have won over the traffic, but that will be certainly different in January. I think that was published. iHeart has also a really strong penetration in the US compared to the Australian application. In Australia, Spotify is bigger than in the US in terms of market share, in terms of install application, and then you see the rest here. Then the last week usage, so the previous slide was really just what people have installed on their phone. That does not mean that they use it every day. So this is more what they're using on in the last week. That's the question. So you see that TuneIn, Google, Spotify, Apple Music, iHeart, and Panora are being used every week. So Panora again will disappear from this next year. So that gives an idea. So it's still different because Spotify is stronger and will probably be even stronger, and maybe SoundCloud will appear there next year. And iHeart I know that iHeart, the local iHeart version, is doing a lot of promotion, so I expect that to grow quite fast in the next year. So if you look here at what people are listening to in the car, you see that podcasts is a bit stronger in the US. Internet-only radio is certainly stronger in the US than here. We saw it on the previous slide where less people are connecting their smartphones into the car because I suppose not a lot of cars have the capacity to download a podcast in the Incar system. And then you look at who's using CDs. There's no DAB in the US, so I made the comparison between satellite radio, so XM, Sirius, and DAB. So DAB penetration seems to be quite small in cars in Australia, and the satellite radio system is much stronger, mostly used by people commuting from states to states to keep the same signal across the whole journey. And then you look into the the air listenership. So in Australia, it's still 3/4 of the driver using that tool, whereas in the US, it's nearing 50%. I wouldn't be surprised that next year, less than 50% of the drivers in the US will be tuning in using the AM/FM tuner because everything is moving towards streaming. So this is a lot of information there. So when someone is using, what type of device people are using to listen to online audio? So the bulk is really mobile. So if you are a publisher or an agency and thinking about audio, you have to think that this is a mobile play. People will consume audio when on their mobile device. So on the move, or either the mobile device connected on the smart speakers or whatnot. And then all the rest is smaller. What we will see growing quite fast is all the smart speakers. So this is a trend that we're seeing quite fast. So it was not part of the study because it was quite new, but you'll see that part of the pie growing fast in the next few years because it's quite convenient to listen to online audio on smart speakers. I don't have the slide there, but if you go on the UK Radar, which is the JIC in the UK, so Radar publish every quarter a listenership of digital audio, and you would see that the smart speakers, most people with smart speaker will be listening to actually radio on the smart speakers, the digital version of radio. So it's a mobile play. What's interesting when we compare, so this is based on Webcast metrics data. So when we look into the Australian consumption of online audio, so online audio, that means everything including music services, you see that the most important day part is in the afternoon, from 3 p.m. to 7 p.m. This is where we have the bulk of the listening of online audio. If we only look into online radio, then it's more the middle of the morning and early afternoon from 10 a to 3 p. So that's interesting because it means that overall people will listen in the afternoon, but just radio, maybe because of the news or the programs, it'll be mostly done during 10 a and 3 p. So different type of consumption based on any type of audio or only radio. So I suppose I don't have the slide pure play only, music service only, so I suppose that'd be even later in the day. So if we compare podcasts, it's actually quite similar in terms of scale, a bit smaller in Australia, but the trend is almost the same. So it's not as if there was a big catch up to do. It's already there. So it's a bit more detailed in the Edison research in the US than Australia, but you would see it's a bit the same. I think the difference is in the US, the 25 to 54 bracket is actually the strongest for the podcast, maybe because of NPR and that type of program. So I'm not 100% familiar about the most popular podcast in Australia, but it's clearly a bit younger than what we see in the US in terms of the audience it attracts. And we see that for older generation, it's still quite small share of the population listening to podcasts. And then when you look at the pie of how many, like what the duration of the podcast and how many podcasts in terms of hours they listen to across the week, the split varies a bit, but the mean is almost the same. A bit over 5 hours of podcasts has been listened to by US or Australian population. So that's the same. That's why I'm thinking that at the moment there's not much catch up to happen in Australia. People are already consuming a lot of podcasts. And 5 hours a week is good because if you do sponsorship, that's good. But if you also start doing transactional advertisements with pre-rolls, mid-rolls, and whatnot, there's actually a fair amount of listening. So that could be quite good for reach and frequency. So where people are listening, so it seems that in Australia there's more people walking around listening podcasts than in the US. Maybe they're driving most of the time, so that's interesting. Otherwise, the US are people at the gym are listening to podcasts more than Australia. Public transportation, in-car truck is almost the same, a bit reversed, but in the same bracket. At home, it's almost 50-50. At work, a bit more in the US than in Australia. Yeah. So that's interesting statistics. I suppose that really depends what type of strategy you have in terms of reaching your audience, if you prefer reaching them at home or at the office. And the listening methods. So in the US, we see that on-demand podcast is really the way to go. More than 60% of listening is done on demand. It's no longer downloaded. So that's why for a lot of people in the US, the announcement of iTunes providing more data on listenership is not that much a big news, because all the publishers shifted towards making sure that people will be using a control environment like WNYC in New York City. You use their application to listen to the podcast because they want to control the experience. And then you see that the downloaded part is smaller. But in Australia, it's still not yet 50% of the listenership of podcasts, which is done on demand. So here I wanted to just give an explanation of what you can do with online audio advertisement, both on podcast and live streams when you listen on IP. So you could buy a pre-roll, you could insert a pre-roll, but the technology exists to replace the over-the-air spots by digital ads one-to-one. That means that if you are in Sydney listening to a Melbourne station or a New York City station, you don't get the over-the-air spot ad when in the middle of the program. You can get targeted ads. And then with that concept and capacity of targeting, replacing the spot in real time, you can do more sophisticated execution. You can, for instance, keep the same spot, append a banner to it, so then you could use the banner to drive clicks or drive conversion. Or you could have the same advertiser, but then run different creatives on the digital stream. So it might be a national campaign, but then if you're in Brisbane or in Sydney, you can have a slightly different creative on the digital streams to target to a specific store. So that's an example. Or you could split your market. You know that the spot has reached its maximum value and cost per point, but you want to split the digital signal with other more local advertisers. You could do that, replace a promo by an ad, or replace out of market, meaning that an advertiser could buy Sydney as an IP address zone, but outside of Sydney could be another advertiser taking the same spot because it's out of market or out of Australia. So for us, for publishers, they can start earning money outside of their own country. Or for a marketer, like the example I gave, you want to target Spanish speakers in Australia. You know, you could buy audience coming from Prisa Radio in Australia. So that's the way you could think about digital audio. And then in terms of targeting, it's beyond what you could do with the spot market. You could target based on registration. when you know that they have registered audience. The panel just before my presentation talked about registration. So that's more and more common. It's already there for online music service, but more and more podcast producers and AM/FM radio broadcasters have a registration, not necessarily mandatory, but registration gate. Then you could also use the same methodology for display and video. So you could use cookies, mobile ad ID, so for targeting, retargeting, tracking, and all of this. And in terms of geography, you could target based on the region, on the metro, or even on the GPS when it's enabled to use really precise mobile targeting. And then on device. So it's becoming more and more popular to target, let's say, smart speakers, because you may have a creative that has voice-activated controls. So you only want to run that creative when you know it'll be on Amazon or Google, and you can have that interaction. Or if you want to only target mobile users or serve a different creative when users are on a mobile phone, that's all possible with online audio advertising. And then in terms of programmatic, everything is possible, like for display and video. So you could do private deals. There's evergreen deals that you can establish with publishers. And then there's the open exchange in real-time bidding using any known DSPs. So the IAB actually published the audio object in OpenRTB now almost 2 years ago. So audio is no longer in a parallel silo. It's part of the regular type of channel. So whatever DSP you're using, you should be able to buy audio. You no longer need to have a tool built for digital audio. So the same with tracking and attribution in digital audio. You could track everything in digital audio, whether it's the audio per se or the companion banner that goes with it, and that should feed back your main attribution tool. So again, you don't need to have specific things, and it's beyond what you usually get from the affidavit coming from the radio broadcasters for the spot market. So that gives like 2 examples of what it can do. So for that's for a big box retail, the Home Depot type of advertiser. You can see the lift on the website in terms of searching for a location for that advertisers. Retail locations, and then that's for a credit card company. So you have the small bar is the regular campaigns, and then when you added audio, it brings brand awareness and credibility and trust, so increase by 4 times the conversion to get the credit cards. So those are some examples of what you can accomplish with programmatic audio. So that's what I wanted to share in terms of data, and I think you have to know that digital audio, as you saw in the slides, there's actually a fair amount of listenership already there, and should be part of your media marketing mix. And if you're digitally savvy in terms of buying or attribution, all the touch points are there following the standards of the IAB, so there's no reason why it should be difficult for you to transact and track what's happening in digital audio. And as Gay alluded to, I was traveling often to Australia for different events, but now we're pleased to have Richard Palmer that joined us locally here to help steer the marketplace and answer the questions, because I think the Australian market and APAC in general is really growing quite fast in that area. Thank you. So any questions? I'm available.